So in the last video, we did a very quick tour around Visual Studio and how it works, how the model view controller is implemented, and how the rounding works. So now we have a pretty good foundation and a pretty good idea on how everything is kind of connected. So in this video, we are gonna start building our actual application. Now, the first thing that we want in a cookbook could be an ingredients model or table. So let's have a look at that. So if we're developing a cookbook, we basically want to create recipes, right? And in a recipe, we have ingredients. So an ingredient, I need to work on my spelling, but an ingredient is stuff like a cucumber, cheese, meat, stuff like that, different kinds of ingredients you could include in a recipe. So this is the very basics that we need to set up. Now, an ingredient definitely has a name that identifies it, like, cucumber, carrot, stuff like that. And we also want to give it an ID, which, I do that pretty much on all my tables. And this is going to be the private key, that's going to also increment. Now we could add stuff like categories, but we're just going to keep it simple right now, and we're just going to make a basic ingredient model. So let's go into Visual Studio and implement our model. So Visual Studio, or .NET Core, uses something called the code-first approach. So if you're coming from another background, you might be used to going into your database and making the table first. But in .NET, we are actually going to code first. So we're going to open up the models folder. And right now we only have a review model. So we want to create a new model called an ingredient. So we simply right click and go under add. And then we have class. And we do that while we have selected the models folder. So we right click on the models folder. We have selected an ASP.NET Core class, just a basic C# class, and we're going to name it ingredients. It's going to load that up, and now it has created our model, and we can see it is also placed in the models folder, and it is in the namespace my cookbook models. So we wanted our model to have a ID and a name. So the way we do that is we create two properties. Now the shortcut for doing that in Visual Studio is simply to write prop and then double tap. Then it will create the property for you, and it will automatically have selected the data type. And the first one we want to create is an ID, and that's a normal integer. So we simply press tab to go to the next line. So now we can name it, and we are simply going to name it ID. And it has a getter and a setter, and we're going to leave it at that. So now we have created the first property. We create another one, write prop, double tap, and this is going to be a string because this is going to be the name. And remember, by convention, I believe that we also use the capital first letter for properties, but again, it's a convention. You don't have to do that. Now, one thing that we need to remember when we are making this model is that we need to somehow tell the database that this ID is a private, the private key, it's the primary key, the primary key, and we need it to auto increment. And the way we do that is using something called data annotations. Now, a data annotation is something that's placed in square brackets right above the property that they are referring to. So in this case, we want to tell the system that this property right here, the ID property, is the primary key and that we need to auto increment it. So the way we do that is simply to make the square brackets and type key with a capital K. Now we can see that there's this red squiggly line under it because it doesn't know what I'm meaning. So I can press the light bulb here. Whoops, just going to try that again. Hover over it, press the light bulb arrow. And this is a suggestion. So right now it's saying I don't know what this is, but maybe it is something that is in the system component model data annotations. And remember I said that this is called data annotations. So it's simply because we are not using this component. So we just need to press that and it will import the using statement for data annotations. And now we can use all the available data annotations. And if we hover over it now, it says that denotes that the key data annotation denotes one or more properties that uniquely identify an entity. And that is exactly what this is doing. It is uniquely identifying this particular entity. Great. So now we have created the actual model. The next part is actually getting this model into the database, because this is the beauty of ASP.NET. If we pull up the whiteboard here, the way this is working is that right now we have created a model class. Now the model we have created is an ingredient model. And the cool thing about this is that, if you were just making a regular desktop application, this is how you would do it, right? You would create your models and you would just create instances of it and start working with it. The cool thing about .NET is that it will actually take this model here and it will create a table in our database. So it will kind of mirror this model in the database, so that when we start to work with the database, we are essentially just doing it through the model, and this connection here will happen kind of automatically. So before we can actually do that, we need to install a database, and that's what we're going to do right now. So if you don't have a database on your system, you can just go into Google and you can simply write download Microsoft SQL. The very first one we get is something called the SQL Server Downloads. So if we go into that one, we scroll down, and right here, this is in Danish, so it's gonna be in English for you, but we're gonna look the same. We have this. It's gonna be called a developer server. So that's just an SQL server that you're downloading and installing on your machine. So you need to download that so that you get the actual database on your machine. Now, after you have the database, you need a graphical user interface in order to work with the database and to look at it. And for that, you write download Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. It's kind of a long name, SSMS for short. If you hit the enter button there, we have the very top one that says you can download the SQL Server Management Studio, SSMS. You click that, and then you can simply download it right here. This is the program to manage your SQL server, and I think in here, in the upper right corner, you might have a link to download the SQL server. Yeah, then you go into the same screen. But you need those two programs installed on your computer. Now, after you have installed both programs, you can tap the Windows key or in the lower left corner, and you can write SQL, and it will pop up with the Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. And you can open that one up, and then you will get presented with something like this. Now, when you're first installing it, it'll pop up with just a window with your general information. You can take a screenshot of that so you have it. But after that, when you open it, it'll just have everything filled in, so you can just press connect. And my localhost environment is just the desktop. It's the name that's been given. And then I have a lot of different folders, and the one we're interested in is the one called databases. You can open that one up, and you probably don't have anyone right now. You maybe have like a system and a database folder, but you probably don't have the two databases down here. But if you can get this far and it's looking kind of like this, then we know that we have the localhost database installed so that we are ready to connect to it. This is something you need to do just once per machine. So this is not every time you make a product, obviously. So this is just to have the database running on your machine. I mean, you can use all different sorts of databases in your environment, but this is free and easy for just testing and developing your application. So we go back into Visual Studio, and now we need a way to actually connect to the database. And in order to do that, we need to install something called nuget packages. And nuget is just a package manager system. If we open up the dear whiteboard here, it is just that, we might have an application. Let's just say this is our application. And we might need to use a lot of different systems or subsystems or packages that do different things for us. For instance, to connect to a database or stuff like that. So our app is using something called nuget. So we just erase that. Then we actually have this package manager called nuget that our app uses, and that gets all the packages that we want in a nice and clean way. So in order to use nuget, you go up into Tools, you go into the nuget package manager, and then you press Manage nuget packages for solution. Then it opens up this window where you can see all the installed packages you have, and you probably only have the Racer runtime compilation, because remember we checked that off when we created the project. You can click Browse, and you can find a lot of different packages that do a lot of different things. What we need is something to connect to an SQL server, so I just write SQL, and then we need to download the Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQL server. So we press that, and we can see this is developed by Microsoft. It has 112 million downloads, so this is probably what we're after. And right here in the right-hand side, we need to click on our project that we want this package to be installed to. We can see that it's not installed right now. We can choose which version we want, and we're just going to take the latest stable version. And we're going to press install. So you can see the bottom starts to install the package. We get a license agreement. It's going to accept that. And you can see in the bottom it's installing, and everything was successfully installed. We get the green check mark. It is also now listed under the installed tab here. So now we have 2 packages, and we can also go over into our dependencies and open packages. And you can see we now have the SQL server, and if we open that one up, we can also see that we have a SQL client here, and we also have a relational entity framework core. So we have a package here that is actually using 2 packages itself. So once you have that, then you actually have everything that you need in order to start connecting to a database. So we don't connect directly to our database. Our application, if we can get clean view, there we go. Our app doesn't connect directly to a database. We have kind of abstracted from this. We were trying to decouple ourselves from directly going to a database, because our app doesn't need to know what it's communicating with. Like, it could be a database, it could be a file, it could be, a number of different things. So what we are actually doing is that our app is using something called a dbContext class. Now, the dbContext is the one that's responsible for connecting to our database. So again, it's kind of like with the nuget scenario here. Our app is not talking directly to the packages, it's talking through nuget. And it's kind of the same here. It's talking to our database through our dbContext. So what we need to do now is to actually implement this dbContext right there. So we go back into Visual Studio, and we go into our data folder. And if you have a look at your folders, we actually don't have a data folder. So I'm going to right click on my cookbook, and I'm going to add a new folder, and I'm going to call it data. In the data folder, I'm going to create a new class. So add a class, and we're going to call this one application dbContext. Now this class needs to inherit from dbContext. And when we write that, it comes with the auto suggestion here and say that we need to use the entity framework. And the entity framework is usually what has to do with entities like your models and the database stuff. So now we can see we have inherited from the dbContext. What we need to define in here is we need to create a constructor. Now, just as with the properties, we have a shortcut. We can just write ctor, double tap, and it will pop in the constructor for this particular class. As an argument, we're going to pass in a dbContext options of type application dbContext called options. Options, and then we're going to write the base options here. And this is just a setup that we need to do. It's just to hook it up to the inherited dbContext that we have. And then Visual Studio is going to work its magic to set it up. This is our application dbContext. Right now it's set up and it knows everything it needs to know. Right now we just need to tell it which kind of table it needs to create. So we want a table for our model class, right? For our ingredients. So we create a property, a public property of type dbSet and of type ingredients. And it doesn't know the ingredients because we haven't imported the models. There we go. And the name we give this property is the name of our table in the database. And by convention, it actually suggests it for us here. The suggested name is ingredients in plural. So we're going to use that. And then we're simply going to create the getter and the setter for it. That's it. This particular line right here is telling this dbContext class to create a table in our database, if it doesn't exist yet, called ingredients. And the ingredients table will be of ingredient entity objects or models. Great, so now we have created the model. We have created the application dbContext that will push this up to the database. Now we need to connect to the database. In order to do that, we need to add in a connection string, and a good place to do that could be in the app settings. So the app settings JSON file is a file where we can put various app settings, obviously. So at the very top here, we are just going to create connection strings, and it actually pops in as a suggestion for us. We are going to make a default connection, and then we need to tell it where to connect. So we need a server, and I'm just going to write a question mark for it. We'll write the semicolon for the next part. We're going to tell it a database. We write a question again. A semicolon for the next one. We are going to make this a trusted connection equal to true, because we do trust this connection. And we are going to set multiple active result sets to true. There we go. So we need now a server, and we can simply open up the Server Management Studio, and this here is our server. So if we right click on it and we go into properties, we can actually see the name right here. The name here, it says the name of the server. So this here is the name of this particular server that we want to connect to. So we can copy that and paste it in right there. So our server equals that. And then we just need to name the database. I will call this one Cookbook YouTube. You can call yours just Cookbook but I have another one called Cookbook, obviously for testing purposes. So you can call yours whatever you want. You can call it My Master Cookbook or Master Chef Book. It's just the name of the database. So this is the connection string that our class needs to use to connect to this particular database. So if you ever change databases, it's simply just to go in here, change the connections, and everything will work and migrate over to the new database. So that's pretty smart. So in order to hook it all up, we need to go into the startup class. Now the startup class is, well, where a lot of startup things are happening. The program is calling the startup class to set a lot of different things up. And we need to go into something called configure. which is right here. No, wait. There we go. Configure services. There we are. It gets called by runtime, and we can use it to add what's called services. And we're going to talk more about services in another video. But right now, we simply just need to add something at the top of the file. And what we're going to do here is add the dbContext to our application, because right now we have defined the application dbContext here in the data folder, but we need to kind of hook it up into our application and to tell our application to actually use it as the dbContext. And the way we do that is just to tell the services that we get passed in here, it's a collection of services, to add a dbContext. Now the dbContext will be of type application dbContext that we need to import. There we go. And options, we make the little rocket ship, or what you call it. And then for options dot use SQL server, and then we can do that on the next line here. We write configuration dot get connection string, open up another bracket or another parenthesis, and tell it to use the default connection. And here we have something we need imported as well from the entity framework. There we go. So you don't have to understand this at all. You don't have to worry about it. You just need to know what it does. And it adds the dbContext to our application. The dbContext, you know, our application dbContext right here that we created. And it uses an SQL server with a connection string called default connection that is automatically fetched right here. So that's how that works. That is just a setup. You don't have to, you don't have to beat yourself up if you don't understand it. I don't understand it fully myself. You just need to know what it does. Write it down, take a screenshot. You can Google it if you ever lose it, but that is just basically how you hook everything up and tell your application to use this particular dbContext, and then everything is kind of hooked up. Now all that's left right now is to actually, get it working. But in order to do that, we need to get one more NuGet package. So we go up into the package manager, and we go into browse, and we search for tools. And then we get here the entity framework core tools. We need this one to our project, so we're just going to install it. Now what it does is that you can actually view a description right here. It enables commonly used commands that has to do with, basically what we're going to do right now, creating our database and creating something called migrations. So we're going to install that one. We're going to accept this one because we have surely read all the terms and agreements. Just going to wait for it to install. Now it has successfully installed right there. We get the green check mark. We can verify that it is in our installed tab. Everything's looking great. So now everything is hooked up. Let's quickly recap. We have created our model ingredients. We have created the dbContext that's responsible for talking to our database. We have made the db set of ingredients, which tells our database to create, or which tells this dbContext that we have a collection of ingredients that we want stored in the database. Then we have inputted our connection string to which server we want to connect to, and we have added all this stuff as a service when the application starts, so that we are telling the application, here's the dbContext I want to use, and here's the connection string to connect to this particular server and database. So now we're ready to actually push it up and have it create our database and table. So the way we do that is we go up into Tools and NuGet Package Manager, and we open up the Package Manager console. The tools package that we just installed is what is enabling us to use these commands. And the first command we have to run is called add migration. And then we're going to give it a migration name. So we're just going to call this init db and create ingredients table. So it's a very concrete name. Now we're going to press enter and it'll say build started. Hopefully it'll succeed. There, you have to let it run all the way through, and you know it's done when it says, you know, build started, build succeeded, something about an undo, and then it says PM for package manager, and it is flashing, waiting for your next input. Now we've created a migration. It's kind of like making a commit to, you know, if you're using a version control system. It's just, you know, what we're about to do now. So now we have committed our changes. Now we need to push it to the database. And the way we do that is simply just to write update database. Before we run this command, nothing's happening. I mean, we haven't created a database yet. We've just migrated all the changes and they are ready to get pushed up into the database. Just like, you know, when you're committing changes before you push them up into your version control system. So we run this command, press enter, it'll build, succeed, and hopefully, there we go. It says done. And at this point, we should have a database and a table created for us. So let's open up the Server Management Studio and let's press the refresh button or F5. So open up the databases. And we can see now we have a cookbook YouTube database, or whatever you name yours. And if you expand it and go under tables, you can see that we have down here an ingredients table. Let's right click it and just select the top 1,000 rows just so we can see the structure. And then down here in the bottom we can see it has an ID and a name. Amazing. Everything is hooked up. Now I know this was a kind of long, it was a long video and there was a lot of setup and a lot of stuff that might be confusing. So it's very important for me to point out that you shouldn't be discouraged now. I mean, you might sit down and think, dear God, is it really this confusing? Is it really this hard just to, you know, work with a database? But the truth is that we did a lot of setup, but you only do that once per application, right? We've done all the setup, and now whenever we want to make a new table, we just create a new model and we update our context class, and then we just push it up to the database. And then everything will just be hooked up and it'll do all the work for us. And you can see that all this configuration that, you know, we've done now, the work we've put in now, is going to save us so much time in the future when we start to actually work with our data. Because we can practically just work with ingredient models. That's the beauty of the .NET framework, of this ecosystem, that, you know, you just use this code first approach and you kind of just code and work with your application and your data is just, you know, automatically handled almost. So right now you can't really see that before we get further into the course, but just stick with me for a few more videos and just remember that all the stuff you've seen in this video is just configuration, it's setup, you do it once per application, and then you don't have to worry about it for that particular solution again. So that's it for this video. Stay tuned for the next video where we're gonna actually start to create some ingredients. So thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next video.